and gents, I have the pleasure of introducing to you Mr. Yori Kvitchko.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah.
Ooh.
He's worked as a software engineer in a variety of industries, from financial services to mobile backends to computer security, before finally turning his longtime hobby of games development into a career. Who likes to play games? All right, listen to this man. He's got all the ins, all right? He's a programmer for Sleep Ninja Games. He helped develop Monsters Ate My Birthday Cake, which was published by the Cartoon Network. So he's made bank too. He's currently working on their next game and spends his spare time volunteering, fantastic, and organizing video game events and workshops. So definitely find out his information afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I love this beautiful little death trap that you provided for me. It's very kind. It's the pit. It's awesome. If I get a little bit too distracted talking to you today, we may have a really entertaining backflip type moment as I land very gracefully on my neck and possibly keel over. So let's hope that doesn't happen. But like that very kind introduction, again, my name's Yori. I work here in town for a tiny little studio called Sleep Ninja Games. There are 3 of us that work together, and we are an independent studio. So for those of you who are maybe a little bit familiar with the game scene, there's kind of like indie games, there's AAA games. Those are sort of the 2 big categories. AAA being these like huge companies, and then indie being small to medium-sized companies generally that are, again, generally independent, as in they're not necessarily beholden to a larger company, they're not necessarily beholden to some other larger entity, so they've got a little bit more creative freedom. And then on top of that, there's a whole entire other gamut of like personal games, all sorts of fun stuff. But I'm not here to give you sort of a lay of the land of the game industry. I'm here to tell you a little bit about how I got into game development. And I like to start out kind of any talk that's sort of advice-ish by saying that all advice is bad advice. Which is to say, not that you shouldn't listen to me, not that you shouldn't pay attention, but that everything that I'm going to say here is going to be very much taken with a grain of salt. Which means it's really going to be up to you to sort of interpret what these things that I'm saying mean to you and how they sort of reflect on your own life. For example, I was very lucky at an early age to have a computer in my household, and therefore I was able to start kind of interacting with a computer, you know, as early as I was 5 years old. Not everyone gets to be that lucky. Not everyone kind of has those advantages, those privileges when they're growing up. And I also got into programming, whereas some of you may be more into writing, some of you may be more into art. There are many other ways in which you can apply your skills in game development, if that's something that you eventually want to do with your lives, either again as a hobby or as a career. So again, take things a little bit with a grain of salt. So my name's Yori. I'm from Sleep Ninja Games. We started about 3.5 years ago, and when we started, we were all working full-time jobs. So not only was I a hobby game developer before my current gig, but actually even when my current gig started, I was still doing this kind of on the side, kind of as a hobby. I was working another full-time job, and then also kind of sort of working a full-time job on top of that. So 2 full-time jobs, not super pleasant, but you know, it's kind of what we had to do to get started early on. We also got lucky in the sense that we had a successful Kickstarter for this game up here. That's Monsters Ate My Birthday Cake. Not only did we have a successful Kickstarter, but we were picked up by Cartoon Network as a publisher, which means that not only did we get a little bit of money from the Kickstarter, but we were able to get a whole bunch of support from Cartoon Network. If any of you watch Cartoon Network and maybe watched Cartoon Network 3.5, 4 years ago, did anyone see commercials for our game by chance? Show of hands. Anybody? Oh, nice. Okay, very cool. Yeah. And so again, we were pretty lucky in that regard. We finished that game, put it out. We made a little bit of money, not a ton of money, but we made enough to go independent. So we all sort of quit our jobs and started working at the studio full-time. And for the last 3 years, mostly what we've been doing is we've been working on contract games, which means that a client, in this case Cartoon Network, pays us to spend a year developing a game, typically for one of their properties. So you see that second game over there, Clarence, 30 Days and 7 Seas. So that was a game that was a contract game that we did for them. And that's sort of how we fund the studio. It tends to be very, very difficult to fund a studio or fund creative work with just your own games. It's very much kind of a shot in the dark. What you typically see is you see all these kind of huge games that are wildly successful, like Minecraft or whatever other independently developed games you might hear about, Super Meat Boy. And you hear about these wildly successful games. What you don't hear about is the thousands or possibly tens of thousands of games that didn't make it and that didn't kind of get released and get wider attention and then didn't make a ton of money. So it's kind of something to keep in mind when we talk about game development, is that it is a really risky industry to go into if you're planning on it, but it is also very fulfilling as well. And again, I'm independent, which is very different from AAA. So independent, we're working kind of for ourselves. We tend to have a lot more creative freedom, whereas AAA, and we're in a very small kind of studio environment. There's only 3 of us, very collaborative. Whereas in AAA, what you tend to get is you tend to get much larger studios. You potentially have hundreds of developers all working on the same project. And if you're going to be working at one of these studios, you're going to be expected to be, again, kind of like working on the sort of little pieces here and there. So you still make a very fine contribution, but you never kind of feel ownership over the whole thing necessarily. You're never going to get a ton of creative control in AAA, at least from my point of view as an independent developer. That's why I decided not to go into AAA, and I can say that. These days, again, we're mostly working on contract games to pay the bills, and we occasionally have time for our own work. So that's a game that we've been working on for 2 years, kind of on and off, while we fill things in. So, how did I get to that point? Well, like I'm sure many of you, I played a whole lot of video games growing up. I was super interested in video games. I played them all the time. Not the only thing I did, there's books and other stuff too, and we'll talk about that. And I really wanted to make games. I thought like, hey, there's this amazing thing that I enjoy. I'd really love to do this full time. And I got some advice from my parents. In this case, it was bad advice, because all advice is bad advice, but I was able to learn a really kind of get a very valuable perspective from their advice. And what they told me was that making games isn't as fun as playing games, which was true, with a little bit of caveat. So what they really meant is that when you make something into your career, when you do something full-time, even though you really love it, there's this phrase, seeing how the sausage is made. So like when you've been playing games for a while, you really enjoy playing games, but once you start making them, you start kind of seeing how they're constructed. You start seeing how much work, and in some cases, tedium, and just plain old boring stuff has to happen, and you start sort of seeing the insides of it, and in a way, I don't want to say it ruins games for you, but there's just like a little bit less of a shine to it. There's a little bit less of a sparkle to it. And on top of that, just like anything else, making games is going to be a ton of work, and when you're working on the same game for potentially a year or 2 years or 3 years, you're kind of, I don't know if anybody's here has worked, what's the longest project that y'all have worked on? Maybe like 3 months? Has anybody worked on a project longer than 3 months? A couple people? Were you completely just like unable to look at the thing? Have you ever gotten to that point where you're just like, I can't even look at this anymore? Well, imagine that with something that you loved so much, with a video game, and you're just like, I can't even look at this. I can't even go home and play video games anymore because I've spent my entire day looking at a video game. So this is sort of the gist of the advice that my parents were giving me, and it was good advice. It was good advice because it gave me a little bit perspective. What I see a lot, especially when I was in college, I took a computer science degree. I was able to get a computer science degree in college, and everybody out around me was like, I want to make games, I want to make games, I want to make games. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking to yourselves, I want to make games, I want to make games, I want to make games. And I'm here to say, absolutely. I think that's an awesome thing to do. But sort of keep in mind, rub off a little bit of that sparkle, rub off a little bit of that magic, because just like any other industry, making games isn't special. It's you know, in some ways it's just a job. There are tons of other exciting jobs that are just as interesting, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that as a career. If you're excited about video games, a career in video games means a very, very specific thing. Whereas what I did was I actually really enjoyed doing games as a hobby on the side for quite a while. So how did I get into game development if I never sort of started out intending to do it as a career? Well, I treated it as a hobby. And for those of you who are kind of looking to get into games, I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that I sort of did, and I'm going to try to apply it to sort of what you can do now. So again, this is the path that I took to try to do game development as a thing I was doing, hobby or career. I'm going to talk about some sort of more concrete examples that you can maybe try on your own today. So again, I decided to do game development in my spare time. I took a job in first the financial services industry. I was working on software for financial people, and then I ended up going to consulting, and then I into computer security, and then I worked in mobile backend. So I worked in a whole bunch of different industries, but the whole time I was in my spare time kind of thinking about what can I do to make myself a better game developer? What can I do to sort of improve my skills? Because hobbies, even though they're hobbies, they still take a lot of work and practice. I'm sure a lot of you have extracurricular activities that you're doing, and all those things take work and practice. And if you want to be a game developer, if you want to be a better game developer especially, then there are a lot of things that you can do to sort of improve your craft, apply your day-to-day to your hobby. And again, I often want to point out that I was very lucky that I was working in tech. Tech tends to be a much higher paying industry. That may have something to do with why this series of talks is called Tech Talks. It's a really great industry to be in. It's high paying. There tend to be a lot of benefits. And I was very lucky that I was able to get into that industry. Again, computer security and mobile development and financial software, all these things. So I had a lot more free time on my hands, and I had a lot more flexibility. And again, some of the things I'm going to talk about, doesn't mean you have to do every single one of these things, to become a game developer. These are just some of the steps that I took, that if you do one or two of these, at least they might be helpful, again, if you want to get a little bit better. So the first thing I did was I sort of decided is probably too much, attributing too much of a decision to it. I was kind of already going to be doing programming no matter what. It was the one thing that I was good at. It's the one thing that I thought I could do. I was no good at art, writing, or design. But if you're going into video games, again, there are a lot of different avenues. There's programmers, there's artists, there's game designers, there's writers, there's even producers and game testers. There's all sorts of other jobs in the games industry if you're interested. And what I started to do is I started to pick games apart. I started to not just play them, not just enjoy them, but really kind of analyze them, think about them. And in some cases, I started actually kind of tweaking them, seeing how they work on the inside. I started modding games. So modding games, if you're not familiar, is when you take a game and maybe the game has some art, or it has some levels, or it has some code that you can change, and you kind of tweak things a little bit. Like, you change the amount of time between actions to 0, and then you can infinitely hit something really, really quickly. Like, there's all sorts of fun stuff that you can do by modding games. And I even did a little bit of maybe cheating and hacking stuff. Not that I'm condoning it, but it is an interesting way to sort of see the innards of how a game works and how that happens. Nowadays, it's actually a lot easier to do that. There's Minecraft mods. How many of you play Minecraft? Show hands, show hands. How many of you have installed or played around with mods in Minecraft? Nice, a couple of people. Yeah, try looking at how those are built. There's some kind of great tools out there for sort of seeing the innards of Minecraft. Has anyone made their own avatar in Minecraft? their own art in Minecraft. A couple people, yeah. So there's artistic modding as well. It doesn't have to be programming. You can do levels for a game. You can do art for a game. All sorts of stuff. Last time I taught a class that was a high school age class. A lot of people were doing Pokemon Go, kind of emulation and maybe location cheating. Your account probably got banned if you did this. My account got banned because I did this, but it was a great way for me to stop playing Pokemon Go because it was taking up way too much time. But yeah, so check out what your favorite game, see if it has a modding community, see if it has some opportunities for you to kind of try things out. And so then I got into college. Again, I was doing a computer science degree, and I joined a couple of modding communities. At the time, Half-Life and Warcraft 3 were big. So this is Warcraft 3, and this is my utterly failed attempt at 3D modeling. This is when I decided that that was not where my efforts were going to be oriented. I'm not going to say I was a bad artist, because if I'd practiced for 10 years, I probably could have become a good artist. But I just decided maybe that's not where my efforts were best oriented. You see this eye over here and this little, no, wasn't a good attempt at things. But I was able to practice programming and design within kind of these modding communities and these games. Nowadays, again, there's a whole bunch of modding communities for different games. Steam Workshop is another one that I had on the last slide. Steam Workshop lets you often create different mods, but also 3D models and sometimes levels for these games. That's a great sort of resource to check out. Again, pick your favorite game and look at the Steam Workshop for that game. There's also a whole lot more tools for making your own games these days. These things that you can do kind of right now and jump right into. They have a lot of tutorials online on YouTube. Twine is a personal favorite of mine. It lets you make kind of choose your own adventure book style games. So they're all text. They're very easy to get into and write your own stories that have some kind of choices and even a little bit of programming in there. There's Game Maker, Adventure Game Studio, RPG Maker, all sorts of tools to kind of jump into game development at an early age and really kind of try your hand at it and see if you like it. Let's see. There's also, I also really love fan works, and fan works are a great way to practice your skills. Again, if you're not necessarily a programmer, there's fan art, there's fan writing, so fan fiction, if anybody, fan fiction is still a thing, right? Okay, good. Fan fiction plays a very important role in society, I'm calling it. So there's all sorts of fan works that you can sort of get into games and practice your skills there. Once I got out of college, I was working a job. I was working at the time, I was working for a financial software company doing some nonsense. It was pretty fun at the time. It was challenging and an interesting challenge. Probably not super interesting to y'all. But one of the things that I started doing is not just playing games, I started actually analyzing games. In fact, one thing that I did was that Newgrounds is still around. I don't know if anybody still goes to Newgrounds much, but Newgrounds used to be kind of like the thing for online games. And so what I would do is every single week for a year, I played all of the top 5 games. So that was, let's see, 260 games I played in a year. And these are small flash games, so it was a little bit easier to do that. And sometimes I only put in about 5 minutes per game. But what I was really trying to do was trying to get a feel for games. Like, what does this game do? What does it do well? How's the introduction into the game? Really just separate yourself from the player and become both a player and a designer while you're playing these games. You know, how do you feel in response to something that the game does? Did it make it easy for you to get into the game? Did it teach you well? And really having that extra sort of layer of analysis really helps you understand what goes into making a game and what makes a game good and maybe less good. Yeah, I also have a very hefty Steam library. A lot of that is research. So I will literally just buy a game and play a game for about 5 to 10 minutes, again, just to sort of get a feel for it, get a sense of it, see what it's doing well. And these days, there's a whole lot of YouTube channels that are really awesome introductions to game design. My 2 personal favorites are Extra Credits. which has a lot of different videos, especially ones like this. So you want to be an indie, so you want to be a game developer. They have a lot of introductory ones that are really great. There's ones like, so you want to be a producer, so you want to be an artist, a writer, etc. And Game Maker's Toolkit is a really great sort of deep analysis of the sort of design of games. So they have one series called Boss Keys, which is really great. It talks about Zelda games. Breath of the Wild? Yeah, so good. And then my personal favorite as well, for looking for kind of weird and new games, games that do things differently, games that aren't necessarily big AAA games, commercial games, I would highly suggest checking out itch.io. It's kind of like Steam, but totally free and not super big and corporate. I mean, Valve is pretty cool as companies go, but it's still big and corporate. Whereas Itch is run basically by one person, it's free. So there's a whole lot of games on there that you just would never see anywhere else, that are showing ideas that you might not encounter anywhere else, and that might be using mechanics that you won't notice anywhere else. I would also suggest, if you're interested in video games, not just sticking to video games. Video games tends to be a very, very sort of myopic field. There's a lot of people who only play games, don't go outside of that. But to be a good game designer, you need, you want to be reading a lot of books for world crafting, narrative, playing board games because there's a lot of rules and mechanics stuff. Film for visual language and storytelling. Film has like an entire history of how to tell stories in visual terms, which is what games have to do as well. Traveling is great, and there's all sorts of electives, both in college and in high school, that you can take that are going to inform your game development and your game design career. The next sort of step, after sort of building up my skills, the next thing that I did was I joined a community of other game developers. So here in Portland, we have the PIG Squad, the Portland Indie Game Squad. It's a great way to learn from others. It's a great way to kind of see what others are doing, see what path they took, get some more bad advice that you can then apply, take with a grain of salt, and sort of learn for yourself. And most importantly, I think they host game jams. So game jams are a special event where you take 24 or 48 or a week, 24 or 48 hours or a week, and you make a game in that time. Doesn't matter if it's done, doesn't matter if it works, doesn't matter if it's fun, you just make something. It's super quick, it's super fun, you team up with people you've never worked with before. This is the Global Game Jam, which is one of the biggest ones. 2017, we kind of took over an entire floor of the Art Institute. So there's a whole bunch of us. That's actually only about half of the people that were there working through the weekend and making games together. So game jams are just a really great way to get involved. It doesn't matter how experienced or not experienced you are. You can just jump on a team, form a team of your friends, and just make something. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be done. It doesn't have to be revolutionary. Just making something feels good and is a great way to test out your skills, meet new people, build a portfolio potentially. And then eventually, once I sort of built up my skills and got some more practice and had a couple of games that I worked on myself, I eventually decided that, hey, this hobby thing that I've been doing for a while, maybe I can turn into a career. And it doesn't mean that I didn't necessarily have to, but for me, what really worked is I found the right opportunity. And I don't think I would have turned my game development into a career if I didn't find this right opportunity. I didn't really feel like I had to go into games full time, but it just so happened that there was a happy accident and it worked out. Sleep Ninja was full of people I liked. There were two people who I really enjoyed as people. I enjoyed working with them. I had the time to spare, so I was just finishing up with another job. I didn't have any pressing and urgent needs. Again, kind of going back to that lucky thing. There's a lot of luck that kind of plays into this stuff. And I had some savings so that I could go independent. Independent typically means that you're not paying yourself as much. It's an entrepreneurial thing, right? You're starting your own business. You're starting your own company, which often means you have to invest a little bit of either extra time or your own money in it. And in the long run, for the last 2 years, I actually haven't worked on any game that's been my own. I mean, they're games that we made, obviously, but they're games that we made for another company, for another property. They're games that weren't kind of entirely things that we came up with and we developed. Whereas as a hobby developer, I made 2 games in the same time frame that were entirely my own, or that of my collaborators. So take from that what you will. Eventually, the hope is that we are going to have a chance to make our own games and kind of put our own stuff out there. But again, game development can be pretty risky, so it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to make a ton of money on it, but it's fun while we're doing it. So again, we've been pretty lucky to get good contract work. Game development is pretty tough as an industry goes. We still haven't had a chance to release one of our own games after that first one, after Monsters Ate My Birthday Cake, which again we were doing while we were working other full-time jobs. And the game industry is interesting because it's a combination of the creative industry and the tech industry. So creative can be really difficult because there's not necessarily a ton of money. It's not quite as lucrative as tech, for example. And there's a lot of clients a lot of client demands from the creative industry. Maybe some of you have heard horror stories of like, oh, can you just change the color of that a little bit? Or, oh, I want this to look exactly like, you know, whatever logo. And tech can be a kind of a difficult industry at times too. There's long hours and deadlines coming up and a lot of overtime potentially. And game development is kind of interesting because it takes both of those together. It's both tech and creative, so sometimes you get the downsides. You get the downsides of both, and you get the upsides of both. So again, take it a little bit with a grain of salt. So again, that's sort of my path to game development. That's sort of what I've gotten out of game development. That doesn't mean that you have to do that, but sort of I wanted to give you a little bit more of a realistic, both some of the positives and some of the negative sense of what it means to be a game developer, at least an independent like me. Here's some of the links from what I had. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but I put that slide there anyways.
Maybe at least one or two. Anybody have a question? Yeah. Jesus, can you talk loud enough?
Yeah, sure. What did you use to create your first game?
So we almost exclusively use Unity. So Unity is really big, Unreal Engine is really big, and there's a couple of independent developers that use Game Maker. So those are sort of the big 3 that you'll see around, and there's tons of other examples too, but those are kind of the most popular.
Another question? Oh.
What's AAA?
AAA is sort of I'm not sure if it actually stands for anything, but it's sort of a term for big corporate, the large, huge studios, but they're sort of called AAA. Blizzard, yeah, EA, Ubisoft.
All right, thank you. Oh, no, we got one more.
Got one more question? Here in town, you mean? I'm not sure I understand the question.
He means like games other people make, he like edit them.
Oh, so there's modding. So you just kind of look up in Google if a particular game supports modding, and I would check that out.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.